Tania, your book, Land's End, is relatively thin. It's not a huge compendium of these capitalist relations that you encountered in Sulawesi. So you must have excluded lots of interesting stories, I believe. Could you tell us maybe one of these stories or anecdotes?
So one thing that I mentioned very briefly in the book is that there was a mission run by some Canadian and American missionaries in the highlands, quite far in the interior. And they had been there since 1975. They were part of the branch of the New Tribes Mission. They had a little airstrip and so on. So very much the kind of, missionaries landing, in the middle of nowhere kind of scene.
Yeah.
So I, in general, avoided the mission. And the reason was that I did not want the Highlanders or the people on the coast either to think that I was actually covertly a missionary. They were the only white people they knew. And so I had to be very careful to keep my distance. The last thing I could do was every time I arrived in the area, go and check in with the mission, because that would confirm this idea that I was really one of them. So in my 20 years, I only went there twice. I really did keep my distance. But on the first occasion I went there, the missionaries were first of all a bit suspicious, a bit anxious, because they've sometimes been burned by anthropologists who write very hostile accounts of, how, missionaries are disturbing the indigenous way of things. I didn't have that perspective. I was hugely admiring of the way they had been there for so long. They had raised their own children there. They had learnt the language. And although I'm, neutral on the question of religion, one thing they had done a lot of was public health and education, because they, even from a conversion perspective, like if your folks are dying of epidemics, you're not going to be a very successful missionary, right? So they had intervened as strongly as they could in terms of things like hygiene, how to deal with these dreadful dysentery epidemics and other things which devastated, dozens, scores of people would die in the space of a week during a drought. So I was admiring, of what they had done. But one particular occasion I remember on the time we were there, and I was there with my interpreter, Rina, and I was chatting to the missionaries in English. And so for once, she wasn't needed as an interpreter. And she went off to do her own little investigation. And she went to the clinic, which the missionaries had started up there, and she was chatting to the clinic worker, this young Laoje woman. And Rina was completely bowled over by the story this young woman told. First of all, the woman was handing out a medicine bottle to a client, to a patient, and read the label, which was written in the Laoje language, and it said, "Take this medicine 3 times a day until it's finished." So for Rina, first of all, that Laoje could be written, she'd never seen it written, and that was part of the missionaries' translation. Bible translation involves, creating a written language where it doesn't exist. Secondly, the idea that, as she put it, a red-mouthed woman, like a woman who chews betel nut, in her view, a kind of an icon of uneducated, could read the Laoje language and was actually giving proper medical advice to a patient. Like, there were so many elements of this which really disturbed her notion of these Highlanders as very backward and primitive people. Like, here they were literate, knowing more about how to deal with infectious diseases than the coastal people who wouldn't necessarily properly follow instructions on a medicine bottle.
Why would she have that impression?
Well, because the whole social dynamics were such that people in these further in the highlands are regarded by coastal people like Rina as fantastically primitive and backward, people who couldn't possibly read and write or take medicine correctly. And so she was very impressed, and she told the story. But it became even more dramatic, because what the young woman told her was that a few months previously, another woman up in the highlands had had a horrible gash on her leg, which was infected, full of maggots, and this woman was basically going to die. But the missionaries put her on a plane and sent her to the hospital in Palu and sent this young woman with her to be her, nurse, guardian, accompanier. And so she talked about her experience. So here's this woman from the hills has now been catapulted to the capital city, to a hospital. And her story about how she survived and how she said to the nurses, we're from the sticks. We're really from the sticks. We don't know anything. You're going to have to show us how to do things around here, how to use the bathroom, how to take water from a tap, so many basic things that, of course, this young woman had not encountered. But she was so intelligent and feisty and reflective. And this really deeply affected Rina because she, like all coastal people, had these preconceptions about backwardness. And here was this young woman, and she was the same age as we all were. We were all around, 30 at the time. And she said, wow, she says, so that's what is possible, when you give people some education, when you teach them to read, And so it was a very remarkable sort of shift in her own perceptions, but also a fascinating story. It's one of those kind of eureka moments, more for her than for me, because we're brought up as anthropologists, right? We know that people are malleable and they can learn new things, right? But she was of course imbued with the kind of cultural stereotypes of her milieu, and it was hard for her to shift those things. Initially, she was very afraid to go up into the highland areas, and so she had to relearn her perceptions of who these people were, and were they in fact dangerous, and were they actually so primitive. That was one of the moments when that transformation occurred.
And was it a permanent shift? Did it change the way that she interacted with Highlanders?
I think over time she became more comfortable, just because we did a lot of it. But as I mentioned in the book, there were a few places which really terrified her because some charismatic leader in certain neighborhoods had a reputation for magic, basically, for being able to, inflict damage through spirit means. And a lot of Laogai people, coast and hills alike, are afraid of those kinds of attack. And so she was nervous in some places, but not in others. I think it wasn't universal. And she was often, very appreciative of the effort that people made to make us comfortable. And, she herself was a very practical person. So we would arrive in one of these hamlets and she would make herself busy, go to the kitchen, see was there any water, could she get some water on to boil, did the cooking pots look like they need to be scrubbed before someone tried to cook something in them. She was in her sort of gentle, graceful, practical way. She was trying to keep me healthy, trying to keep herself healthy.
That's important.
And also trying to make our hosts less nervous. The fact that they were, of course, nervous with these visitors, and she would make everyone feel at ease. That was part of the magic of Rina.
Well, I understand why you would have liked to write about this, the mission settlement, which seems to be an important place in your fieldwork, but you couldn't mention it. So thanks for sharing it.
Hi, this is Lukas calling from Semarang, Indonesia. Tania Li's book, Land's End, is published by Duke University Press and will be available in bookstores this summer. Thanks for listening. Salam!